I'm a police officer that quit his job after a paranormal experience. I'm not a superstitious person. Ghosts, demons, spirits, they've always been the stuff of campfire tales, Hollywood movies, and urban legends. I used to believe everything could be explained, that there was always a rational reason for things that went bump in the night. Then that night happened, and now I don't know what to believe anymore. What I saw, what I experienced, it shattered every logical assumption I've ever held about the world. I'm a cop by trade. I've seen the worst of humanity: murders, drug deals gone bad, domestic disputes that turned deadly. But nothing had ever shaken me like what happened that night. I lost more than just my badge afterward. I lost my sense of reality, of what's real and what isn't. My sleep hasn't been the same since. When the department chose to declassify the report, I thought I'd try to bury it in the back of my mind and forget. But that's impossible. The memories of that night claw at the edges of my mind, refusing to let go. Maybe by sharing it, I'll finally get some peace, though I highly doubt it. It all began like any routine noise complaint. Dispatch sent us out to check on a disturbance in a quiet neighborhood. A noise complaint around midnight, nothing unusual. But the neighborhood was strange. It wasn't just quiet. It was completely still, like the whole world had gone to sleep. No porch lights were on, no televisions flickering in windows, not even the distant sound of a car passing by. It felt like we were entering a different realm, a dead zone between the living and the forgotten. My partner, Paul, and I were used to these kinds of calls. Paul was one of the toughest guys I knew, with nerves of steel. He carried a pocket full of lollipops that he'd pull out whenever things got stressful, a strange little habit he'd had since he joined the force. That night, he went through a whole handful of them. We pulled up in front of the house that had triggered the call, a small, two-story home that seemed out of place. The windows were dark, the shutters slightly askew as if something had disturbed them recently. The house seemed to loom over us, its shadow spilling across the lawn like a creeping darkness. I knocked on the front door. "Police? Anyone home?" I called out, my voice sounding unusually loud in the silence of the night. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a little girl, no older than 8 or 10. She had pale skin, long dark hair tangled in knots, and wide, unblinking eyes. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at me, her gaze too intense for a child that age. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to her level so I wouldn't appear threatening. "Is your mom or dad home?" She shook her head slowly, without saying a word. Just that one small motion, her head barely moving, but her eyes never leaving mine. That's when I heard it, a loud crash from deep inside the house, like a stack of dishes falling to the floor. My hand instinctively moved toward my holster. Something was wrong. The girl was alone, and whoever, or whatever, had made that noise wasn't supposed to be there. I glanced at Paul, who had his hand on his belt, ready for anything. "We need to check this out." But before I could step into the house, I needed to get the girl to safety. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Maribel," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely registered over the pounding of my own heart. "All right, Maribel, why don't you come with us for a moment?" I gestured toward Paul. "He's got lollipops." Paul, always the reluctant hero, grumbled as he pulled a lollipop from his pocket and handed it to her. She accepted it without a word, her eyes never leaving mine. There was something so unnerving about her stare. She didn't blink. Not once. Paul led her out to the cruiser and had her sit in the back seat for her safety, while I turned back to the house. The door was wide open now, and I could see into the dimly lit hallway. The air felt colder than it should have been for a summer night, the kind of cold that prickled the skin and settled deep in the bones. "Police!" I shouted again, my voice echoing down the dark corridor, but there was no response. I hesitated at the threshold. Without a warrant, we didn't have the right to enter the house, and normally, I wouldn't even consider going inside without backup. But something about the way the house seemed to breathe in the silence compelled me forward. Against every instinct, I stepped inside. Immediately, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. My breath fogged in the air, and I could hear the faint hum of electricity, though none of the lights were on. The hallway stretched out before me, a dark tunnel that led deeper into the unknown. I took a step forward, then another. Each footfall sounded unnaturally loud against the hardwood floors. I moved toward the source of the noise, my flashlight sweeping across the walls, illuminating pictures of a family, a husband and wife standing in front of the house, smiling at the camera. But there was no sign of Maribel in any of the photos. Just the couple. Over and over, in different places, and at different times. But always alone. No children. No sign that a little girl had ever lived here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, my heart racing, when suddenly the TV in the living room flickered to life. Its volume blasted to full, filling the house with the deafening sound of static. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. And while you're watching, drop a comment below and let me know what you think. What would you do in this situation? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable? I love hearing your thoughts, and it really helps the channel grow. Let's keep the conversation going. I spun around, my gun half drawn, and stared at the television. The screen was just a blur of static, crackling in the darkness. But something was off about it. The static wasn't random. It was almost like there was a shape moving within it. A figure, flickering in and out of view. I bolted outside, breathless, and found Paul leaning against the cruiser, his eyes on the house. "We need to check this out," I said, my voice shaky. Paul gave me a look that said I was crazy, but he followed me back inside. "Mike, what are we doing?" he asked as we stepped into the hallway. "We don't have a warrant. We need backup." "The power's out," I muttered, flicking one of the light switches. "But the TV?" I didn't finish the sentence. Paul didn't need me to. The house felt alive around us. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against us like a physical force. I could feel eyes on me, eyes that didn't belong to anyone human. That's when I saw it. In the mirror across the room, a reflection that wasn't mine. At first, I thought it was Paul, but when I turned, he was standing clear across the room. I looked back at the mirror, and there it was again, a figure, dark and twisted, standing just behind me in the reflection. Its face was obscured, its body bent at impossible angles. "Paul," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Paul asked, his voice tense. He hadn't seen it, but I had. Before I could explain, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder, faster. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, gun raised. "Police!" I shouted. "Show yourself!" No one appeared. But the footsteps kept coming, thundering toward us, like someone, or something, was charging straight at us. I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet, hear the pounding in my ears. And then the objects in the room, lamps, chairs, books, began to lift off the ground, as if an invisible force was sweeping through the house. They flew across the room, smashing into walls, shattering into pieces. "We need to get out of here!" Paul shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of noise. We bolted for the door, stumbling out into the cold night air, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. But the nightmare wasn't over. The siren on our patrol car suddenly blared to life, the lights flashing wildly, as if something was trying to draw us back. I ran over to the cruiser, yanking the door open, silencing the siren. But when I turned to check on Maribel, my blood ran cold. The back seat was empty. Paul stood next to me, his face pale. "Mike," he said, his voice shaking. "Where's the girl?" I shook my head, my mind racing. I don't know." We stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a physical force. Nothing about this made sense. Paul turned to me, his face grim. "Mike, did you see the pictures in the house? The family photos?" I nodded, my stomach churning. "Yeah, what about them?" "Maribel wasn't in any of them." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you saying?" Paul shook his head, glancing back at the house. "I don't think she's real." My mouth went dry. "What the hell does that mean?" "I think whatever's in that house, it's attached to her. Or maybe she's attached to it." "Sonker." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was something wrong about the girl. Something that defied logic. I could feel it, like a dark presence hanging over us, watching our every move. Paul took a step toward the house. "We need to go back in." "Are you insane?" I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off. "It only shows up in the mirrors, Mike," he said, his voice trembling. "That's the key." Reluctantly, I followed him back inside. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself was trying to push us away. Paul picked up a book from the counter and smashed the nearest mirror, grabbing a shard of glass. He handed me another piece, his eyes wide with fear. "We can use this to see it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the shard in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. This was insane. But what choice did I have? We moved through the house, our flashlights illuminating the darkness, the shards of glass reflecting distorted images of the world around us. And then it appeared. A red skeletal figure, its long, bony arms reaching out from the shadows. Its face was twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes hollow and black. It moved toward me, faster than I could react, its claws tearing through my uniform, slicing into my skin. I screamed, firing my gun blindly, but the bullets passed through it as if it wasn't there. Paul opened fire, his shots hitting the creature, but instead of blood, it let out a bone-chilling screech that echoed through the house, rattling the very walls. The figure shimmered, flickering like a dying flame, before disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding side, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Paul didn't answer. He was staring at the mirror, his face pale. In the reflection, Maribel stood behind us, her eyes black as coal. She smiled. "Get out," she whispered, her voice echoing through the house. We ran. When we returned to the station, no one believed us. The cameras in the cruiser had conveniently shut off the moment we entered the house, and without any footage, our story was dismissed as stress-induced hysteria. But then, the missing persons report surfaced. Maribel had been dead for over a year. Her family had disappeared without a trace, leaving the house abandoned. The department quietly closed the case, but I knew the truth. Whatever was in that house, whatever had taken Maribel, it was still there. I resigned not long after. Couldn't live with what I'd seen, couldn't explain it away. But if you're reading this, take my advice. If you ever hear footsteps in your house when no one's there, or if a door creaks open on its own in the middle of the night, don't look away. Don't ignore it. And for God's sake, check the mirrors. Because you never know what might be looking back at you. I left the force after that night. There was no way to explain what happened, no logical path to follow, no comforting conclusion to ease the burden on my mind. I thought walking away from the badge would help, that maybe if I stepped out of that world of chaos and shadows, I could convince myself it wasn't real. But some things, once seen, can't be unseen. And this was one of those things. I tried to go back to a normal life. Got a job working security at a nearby mall, the kind of work that didn't require much thinking. I kept my head down, told myself it was just a bad night, an anomaly. But every time I looked into a mirror, any mirror, I saw her, Maribel. At first, it was just glimpses. A flash of those wide, unblinking eyes in the reflection behind me as I washed my face in the morning. A shadowy outline lingering in the glass storefronts at the mall. Always just out of sight, vanishing the moment I turned around. I could feel her watching me. I knew it wasn't paranoia. You don't survive as a cop as long as I did without knowing the difference between irrational fear and the cold, calculated awareness that someone, or something, is hunting you. The first few months after quitting, I barely slept. Nightmares came like clockwork, pulling me back into that cursed house every time I closed my eyes. I could hear the footsteps in my dreams, always running towards me, but never arriving. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced I'd hear those heavy footfalls outside my apartment door. But when I checked, there was nothing. Paul and I never spoke again after that night. He stayed on the force, but from what I'd heard, he was never the same. One of the guys told me Paul had started keeping mirrors covered in his apartment. Said he wouldn't even look into the rearview mirror of his cruiser unless he absolutely had to. I didn't blame him. I'd thought about doing the same more than once. But then the nightmares got worse. It was about 6 months after the incident when I had the dream. I was back in the house, standing in that dark, suffocating hallway. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I could hear the static of the TV crackling faintly in the distance, and then, as always, came the footsteps. They echoed down the hall, the same heavy running steps, but this time they didn't stop. This time they reached me. I spun around just as a red, skeletal hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing me by the throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The pressure of its claws was so real, I could feel them digging into my skin, squeezing the life out of me. And then Maribel stepped out of the shadows. Her eyes were as black as coal, her face twisted into that eerie, childlike smile. "You didn't listen," she whispered, her voice soft and cold. "You didn't leave." I woke up gasping for air, clutching my throat. My chest ached, and for a moment I thought I was having a heart attack. But when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw the faint outline of red marks around my neck, like the bruises from a hand that hadn't been there. That was the first time I considered the possibility that Maribel had followed me. But I didn't have time to process it, because the phone rang just then, jolting me back to reality. It was Paul. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice shaking on the other end of the line. Something's happened." I hadn't heard from him since that night, so hearing him now, in the middle of the night, immediately put me on edge. He wouldn't call unless something serious was going on. "Paul, what's going on?" "Just meet me now." He hung up before I could ask any more questions. My heart was still racing from the nightmare, but the urgency in his voice cut through the fog of fear. I grabbed my jacket and drove to the location he had given me. A dive bar on the outskirts of town where cops like to go when they didn't want to be found. Paul was already there, sitting in a booth in the back corner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he fidgeted with a glass. "What's going on?" I asked, as I slid into the booth across from him. He didn't look up at first, just stared into his drink. "It's happening again," he muttered. "What is?" "That thing. The one from the house, the one we saw in the mirror." He finally looked up at me, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "It's following me." I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that it was just stress, that we were both still recovering from that night. But deep down, I knew he was right. I'd been seeing the same thing, feeling it, the sense of being watched, the glimpses of Maribel in every reflective surface, the weight of something dark and malevolent that hung over me like a storm cloud waiting to break. "I thought I could outrun it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's getting worse. It shows up more now, even in places where there are no mirrors. I hear it at night, the footsteps." My stomach churned. "What do you mean, no mirrors?" He shook his head, his eyes wild with fear. "I covered them all. Every last one in my apartment, but it doesn't matter. I can see it in the windows, in the reflections in puddles, even in the damn TV screen when it's off. It's everywhere." I felt the blood drain from my face. The idea that the entity could appear in places other than mirrors made my skin crawl. If that was true, there was nowhere to hide, no way to escape it. "I think it wants something," Paul said, his voice dropping lower. "It's not just haunting us, it's looking for something." "Looking for what?" He glanced around the bar nervously, like he was afraid someone, or something, was listening. "I don't know, but I think it's tied to the girl, to Maribel." The mention of her name sent a shiver down my spine. "She's dead, Paul, you know that. We both saw the report." "I know." He leaned in closer, his voice urgent. "But I don't think she's resting. I think whatever happened to her in that house, it's keeping her here, and now it's following us." I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, that we were letting the fear get to us. But the truth was, I felt it too. Every time I closed my eyes, every time I passed a mirror, I saw her. And if Paul was right, then this thing wasn't going to stop until it got whatever it wanted. But what did it want? What could we do to stop it? Before I could respond, Paul's phone rang. He looked at the screen, his face going pale. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the phone. "What do you mean?" He slowly slid the phone across the table. On the screen was the reflection of the bar in the dark, shiny surface of the glass. And standing just behind us, reflected in the screen's glare, was Maribel. Her smile was wider now, darker, and then she whispered, "Check the mirrors." The phone went dead,